Oh, good. I need to leave it that way. Yeah, good. Finally. Sorry. So, welcome to Expert Views on ADR-Ever, a podcast about simplifying the traditional African method of settling disputes or appropriate dispute resolution (ADR) in a bid to attract more users to settle their disputes or conflicts with mediation, arbitration, collaborative law, negotiation, conciliation, and early neutral evaluation. My name is DrChinweEgbunike, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Brighton, United Kingdom, and a fellow of the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution. I am pleased to welcome Krishnendu Mukherjee, Caroline Etuk, and Lawrence Kershen to the EVA show. Krishnendu is a London-based barrister and Indian advocate. Caroline is the former director of the EnuguStateMulti-DoorCourthouse, LMDC, and currently the director of the EnuguStateMulti-DoorCourthouse, ESMDC. Lawrence is a CEDR-accredited mediator, a barrister, and King's counsel. There were so many hats, so I've left a link to their profile below. Let me stop sharing now. Hi, welcome everyone to the show. I'm so honored to have you all.
No, I'm pleased to be here. Thank you. All
right, so without further ado, the first question is for Mrs. Etuk. So it is, what are the past and current states of ADR in Nigeria, particularly mediation, in business cases such as disputes emanating from banks, oil and gas sectors, among others?
Thank you, Chinwe. Well, I'll just go right ahead to say that compared to other jurisdictions in the world, mediation, as we know it, is fairly new in Nigeria. As far as I know, the multi-door-courthouse in Lagos, which was established in the year 2002, was, in a manner of speaking, the multi-door was the first promoter of the formal ADR system. And since then, there's been a very, very steady growth in alternative dispute resolution, particularly mediation. Now, before we've had arbitration fairly established in Nigerian jurisprudence, but mediation has the thing that the multi-door houses have brought on the scene, and it's that's really, really been a growth in that area.
Yeah.
Now, for a while, you know, as a director of the Lagos Multi-DoorCourthouse, I knew that for a while it took us a few years to get businesses interested in mediation, in the formal mediation, having third-party interveners in their disputes. Before then, a lot of negotiation was being done, and for the high-end businesses, arbitration and so on. I know we made a lot of effort. We created a program called mediation commercial strategy for the business sector, and we engaged one-on-one with lots of banks. The banks had lots of disputes, and they still do, especially the banker-customer disputes, and we engaged with the banks, telling them that they could do a lot more for their customers by getting their matters resolved through mediation. It was a hard sell at the time for various reasons. Some of them justifiable, some of them not really important reasons. But we got at least one or two banks then agreed that we could have access to their dispute dockets, and we could screen their cases and classify those that were really ADR amenable mediation, amenable to settlement through mediation, and then that they would move those cases to the multi-door courthouse for intervention. Now, that did not happen we did those classifications, and we found out that about 70 to 80% of the disputes that they had were mediation amenable disputes. But down the line, a few banks did send matters which we resolved successfully. And well, for being a director in Enugu now, we've made more inroads, especially with the SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises. And a lot of those disputes are, for the microfinance banks are actually debt recoveries. Many of them are actually debt recoveries. Now in Enugu, for instance, we had about 500 cases, despite the security challenges we've had in the southeast of Nigeria. We had about 500 cases come to the multi-door courthouse, and about 206 of these cases were actually business-related ones. 45 of them matrimonial cases, and about 200 plus of the other were land, property matters, and so on. So I would say that there's an uptake, there's a serious uptake for mediation in businesses in Nigeria now. I know the oil and gas sector has its own mediation program, which it just started, I think, 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay.
I don't know how well they are doing. Reports say that quite a number of their disputes were being resolved through mediation. So I think there's still a lot to be done, but there's a definite movement in that direction in Nigeria. I can say that with all confidence.
Yeah, thank you so very much for that. Because I know that when I came for my research in 2021, there was the ESMDC introduced a new law, which is the restorative justice. Yeah. So so what are your insights on utilizing restorative justice in settling domestic violence, gender-based violence, and matrimonial cases? Because I know in Nigeria we don't settle matrimonial cases via ADR. So what are your insights on that? Is there any improvement in that area? Okay.
Well, the restorative justice program in Nigeria is still at its very, very nascent stages. It's still at its infancy. Now, to my knowledge, a faith-based organization called the Prison Fellowship of Nigeria have started, providing these services in prisons informally. Now, when the Correctional Service Act 2019 came into being, restorative justice took up a different flavor. Now, only Lagos State has made considerable progress in establishing structures, setting down policies. The courts have practiced directions that have to do with restorative justice and all that. But a lot of that is still at the testing stages.
Okay.
Now, Edo State, I know because I've done some scoping studies for the British Council in various states to determine how acceptable restorative justice would be in those states. So Edo State was one of the states that has also adopted restorative justice. And we are borrowing in Enugu, as it were, a leaf from them.
Yeah.
So we've not actually started.
Yeah.
We are still putting structures on ground. But one thing I must say, Lagos State and Edo State have excluded rape, domestic violence, kidnapping, child trafficking, murder from its restorative justice program.
Hmm.
Those offenses are not going to be dealt with in the restorative justice program. Now, there's been heated arguments, particularly with respect to rape.
Yeah.
Why rape should not be one of those crimes that are handled under the restorative. And these objections are actually coming from the judges, from the judiciary, because judges say the prosecutors are not doing a good job of prosecuting rape cases for different reasons. Some are cultural reasons.
Yeah.
The parents whose children have been defiled, they don't want those matters made public.
Okay.
So eventually, they kind of get the matter settled out of court in private mediation forum.
Okay.
So the judges are saying, the judiciary is saying, if this is happening, so why can't we just bring the restorative justice program?
Yeah.
So that the matters are dealt with, these matters of rape, there's a formal and a proper structure created for this resolution. So that's where we are now. Many of the states, these 3 states, Lagos, Edo, and possibly Enugu is going to do the same thing, removing some of those things. Now, the VAP law, Violence Against Persons law, excludes any form of mediation from domestic violence cases.
Okay.
So those are some of the challenges that we have that eventually would have to be resolved one way or the other. Right? So,
thank you. So what are the cases that restorative justice would settle? Because
basically all the minor offenses like stealing, malicious damage, and all that series of minor offenses will be handled. But when it gets to issues like murder, rape, and all that, they are excluded.
Okay. Oh, thank you so very much for an insight on that. So, Lawrence, please, what can restorative justice offer in the case of environmental harm?
Well, I think that the first thing to say is what makes restorative justice work. And the reason that it works so well in so many cases is that participants get a voice, all of them. And the participants are often much wider than they would simply, if you simply call them victim, then it excludes a lot of people and indeed natural features that wouldn't otherwise get a voice. So the importance of restorative justice, as distinguished from mediation, is that everyone there has a voice if they choose, and you have an opportunity to construct both a resolution, but also to hear each side, hear the other side's needs and concerns. And in the case of environmental RJ, it might well be an oil company on one side and members of a community on the other side. And they have the opportunity to enter into dialogue in a safe space to talk about what's happened, what the consequences of the acts have been that's led to the RJ.
All right, thank you so very much. I also wanted to ask about what cases are settled under restorative justice apart. Of course, we know environmental cases are settled via restorative justice in England. Like human rights cases, can they be settled under restorative justice?
Not sure about restorative justice, but I've certainly had plenty of mediations where there have been human rights elements, allegations, and it is it is perfectly possible to settle them, despite the appearance of these being a black and white situation. It turns out that there are shades of grey and that there are spaces in which a resolution can be found. But I want to go back, if I may, to domestic violence, because I know you were asking about it, Chinwe,
Yeah.
and I have to say that it is to be handled with extreme care. The risks of re-victimizing a person who's been the subject of domestic violence are very high. I know of at least one case where an RJ intervention was carried out, and a little while afterwards, some really terrible things happened in that family. So the learning has been, in this country anyway, that if you're going to do RJ with domestic violence and assault, although less so outside the family, you need to be highly trained. You need to have another layer of training on your restorative justice skills. And you have to tread incredibly carefully, because it is such a volatile and high risk area in which to bring together victim and offender.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so very much. So back to the previous question about environmental cases. So what would persuade companies to engage in a restorative process?
Well, can I say, Jimmy, I like your question very much.
Okay.
It's one that preoccupies me. How do you get a corporate, for example, that is allegedly causing environmental harm to the table? And I thought, in thinking about it, there's various levels. One is they might have a conscience. They might be susceptible to education about the harm that they've caused. I'm starting with the least likely motivator for a corporate to engage in RJ. A much more likely situation is where litigation is afoot, and the corporate is at risk of either civil or even criminal proceedings. If there was an opportunity to have a restorative process, I think that would increase the motivation of the corporate. There's also shareholder pressure, which is we're beginning to see where shareholders are divesting rather than investing because they do not like the policies of the business. And a couple last things. One is not calling it restorative justice. One of the things that I've discovered is if you go to someone saying, will you take part in a restorative justice process, what they hear is justice, and they see themselves, probably rightly, as being on the receiving end of all this. So finding other language has been one of the things that I've sought to do, so that it doesn't seem like a justice process, but with the same principles at the heart of it. And lastly, and this was something that was very successful in a recent one I did, is to present the business case or a business case to why they should engage. And that might involve tangible benefits because there's a particular dispute, but it might also include intangible benefits such as social capital, better relationships with the local communities, and so on.
Okay, thank you so very much. So, Krishnendu, so what future does ADR hold or have in human rights due diligence and business cases?
Well, I think it should have a very important place in resolving human rights and environmental violation cases. In my experience, really is based upon 15 plus years of working in the Indian context on environmental human rights cases, and you can see situations where ADR restorative justice can have a very important role. So, for instance, in cases where there's no clear cause of action, so you may have multiple stakeholders, multiple actors, multiple companies, states which are multiple state actors, so not just one state actor, central state actor, local state actor, state actor, and you have within that context a huge gap in enforcement of law. And I think getting people around the table discussing how that situation can be improved would really be important, because at the moment what happens is, in the Indian context, is litigation happens or campaigning happens, advocacy of NGOs happens. That can obviously take years, and even when a good order is obtained, it could not be enforced on the ground. And when we talk about the business case, I really think there is increasingly a business case. So one of the areas I work in is in Rajasthan, among the mining industry in Rajasthan. It's an artisan mining industry of minor minerals. There are 33,000 mines there, 3 million mine workers, around 300,000 child workers, bonded labor, very high prevalence of occupational disease, sexual harassment, and so on. And there's also an export market to that, to the US, to Europe, to the UK. What we understand is that consumers are becoming much more in tune with the provenance of the goods which they're getting. So they're becoming to realize that goods of this type are quite often produced in places where there's child labor, bonded labor, and so on. And that, I think, has resulted in some of the companies actually being frightened to source from countries like India, because they can't guarantee the provenance of what they're importing. So there's certainly a business case to improve the situation, both in terms of the situation in India, but also in terms of companies who import it. And the other situation, I think, is, again, where there's a significant delay in litigation. In the Indian context, it can take 15-20 years for a case to be finally decided. And even when it's decided in favor of the claimants in terms of human rights and environmental breaches, those orders are quite often not enforced. Now, restorative justice, ADR, would, I think, serve a considerable role in trying to implement some beneficial initiatives on the ground. It may not have solve all of the demands of the communities and so on, but it may have a significant effect in recognizing those demands.
Okay, thank you so very much for that. So, as a barrister, what is your advice for adopting or using mediation in certain human rights and violation cases?
Well, I'm very optimistic, in fact, because and Chinwe, obviously you attended Doughty Street's webinar on public procurement, and this issue of due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence is something that is growing in momentum. And part of the human rights and environmental due diligence is having what's called an operation level grievance mechanism. That could be a company level grievance mechanism. It could be an industry grievance mechanism where companies get together and have an operational level grievance mechanism, or it could be a geographical grievance mechanism. But that really, as far as I can see, is an attempt at recognizing grievances and acting upon grievances before they turn into something much bigger. It's trying to open the discourse between those who are aggrieved, workers, communities, and in the wider area, and those who could be contributing to that, but also play a part in solving that issue. together to see what can be done. So that's, as far as I can see, you know, the world, or the world, at least Europe, and I would say even in the Indian context, that is being recognized, that it's much better to not to try and recognize these problems initially and try and solve these problems initially, rather than pushing people to go to litigation.
Yeah, thank you so very much. I think from what everyone has just said, it shows that it demonstrates that ADR has, in the past, it had limited scope, but now it has expanded, and we're even talking about settling human rights due diligence cases, and human rights violations cases as well. Because in business, I think from developing countries, we've had that in place, but now all over jurisdiction, ADR is pretty amenable to almost all cases, I would say. So yeah, that's a good one, for ADR. So thank you so very much. So the final question is, should ADR be the first option rather than the second option? Because in the past, ADR, like, that's why it's called an alternative. Before, some scholars said, no, it's appropriate. So what are your take on this? Should it be the first protocol of settling disputes, or the second protocol? Thank you. Anyone can, this is
well, I mean,
I
I think we have this saying, at least among activists in India, that litigation should always be the last resort, not the first resort. And that you go through everything else, including, sitting outside company headquarters or state headquarters and going on hunger strike before you even contemplate litigation, because of the difficulties, especially when you take litigation against corporations. So, so again, I would reiterate that this whole process of having an ability of those who are affected to go up the supply chain to the larger, most influential companies is really important. But I feel, unfortunately, that unless there is some sanction, it's unlikely really to become very mainstream. And the sanction could be, loss of brand image. It could be consumers, again, complaining. And that's why I'm very keen on things like Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, which, should put out companies steps to ensure there's no exploitation in their supply chain. But also, really, there should be some form of administrative sanction, at least, if not something more severe. So fines, criminal sanction in the worst cases. All these things are part, I think, of the repertoire of a regulatory authority, ensuring that ADR is used and ADR is effective.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so very much. Mrs. Etuk?
I would say ADR first.
Yeah.
Because it's less time consuming.
Yeah.
Party participatory. Parties, the disputants should have a goal at their dispute. Try to get it settled with the help of a third party, and it's less costly. And I think ADR first, and if that fails, then litigation.
Yeah.
Right. If it succeeds, then great. That's fine for the parties. And under the multi-door-courthouse program, our key selling point is that those disputes, even if they were not within the court, could actually be sent to court and adopted as the judgment of the court, and the parties have closure.
Okay.
So I'd say
ADR first, yeah. Thank you. Lawrence, how about you?
I had a thought. because one of the advantages of being ancient like myself is that I've seen since 1994, when I was accredited as a mediator, I've seen the shift from when we first started training mediators, explaining that this was not crazy woo-woo stuff. This was actually serious. Then Lord Wolfe produced his civil procedure rule changes at the end of the 90s, and that supposedly put mediation as the first stop. Well, of course, it hasn't happened like that. It has to some extent, and it's growing.
Yeah.
Most mediators that I know feel frustrated that there's not a massive take-up. But my point is this: we have reached a point now where the courts are so overloaded and the mechanisms of justice are so imperfect, as I think they are certainly in the UK, that the Ministry of Justice has just announced a mandatory mediation scheme in the small claims court. Now, in itself, those aren't big claims. I forget, Krishnendu, is it 10,000 is the limit in small claims? Don't remember.
I think so, yeah.
So they're small claims, but the fact that the MOJ was willing to mandate the use of mediation, and presumably there are sanctions if people don't engage in mediation, that is a straw in the wind, I think. That is an indicator that there's going to be more compulsory mediation. And where once upon a time I would have died on the barricades fighting for the voluntary nature of mediation, I think, given the slow shift, the cultural shift that has to take place between people looking to a third party to say they're right and the other person's wrong, it's a shift to empowering the individual or the corporate, whatever it is, to find their own resolution. And that takes time. That's a big sea change that has to take place. So I think that that's what we're in the middle of, certainly in this country. And it sounds like, from what Caroline has said, that there is, just to have a multi-door courthouse is a pretty major achievement, for which I congratulate.
Well, thank you so very much for your input. Thank you everyone for your input. This is indeed a masterclass. I truly appreciate everyone for that graced the show. I am truly very grateful, and I believe that potential users would embrace everything you said here on the show and opt for ADR whenever the need arises. It's been quite insightful and educative at the same time. Thank you so very much for coming on the show. I'm truly grateful.
No, thank you, Chinwe. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Caroline.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Cheers. Bye.